And thank you again for inviting me today to speak this event at the Africa Students News Summit. As we said there, my role is in the UK predominantly, but I also convene an initiative called World Access to Higher Education Day, and the All Africa Students Union were kind enough to be engaged in the third World Access to Higher Education Day, or WAHED, which only occurred 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to focus really my remarks specifically in the area which I undertake most of my work, which is in the area of higher education or university education, and look again at this issue of the roundtable, looking at finding sustainable funding to protect education. I'd like to say as well that particularly, I probably agree with everything I've heard today, particularly from the last speaker. And I guess in the context of my remarks, they're a little more focused, but they certainly exist in the spirit of what's been said in the event so far. So anyway, the extent of disruption caused to global education and higher education systems by the pandemic can hardly be underestimated. Research by the World Bank suggests that in April this year, universities and research education institutions were closed in 175 countries. Over 220 million post-secondary students had their studies significantly disrupted due to COVID-19. In economic terms, the impact of the pandemic on higher education is huge, and has pushed some institutions into insolvency. The impact on those wishing to enter learning from low-income and other marginalised backgrounds will be the greatest, more likely widening the gaps that already exist between these groups and their wealthier counterparts. Research which I led myself in 2016, looking at participation in higher education across the world by social background, shows that in all of the countries of the world where we have evidence, that's over 90% participation is unequal. Inequities in university systems is a challenge that transcends both rich and poor countries. It's not the case that, okay, it may be different in scope and scale, and it's more pronounced in poorer countries. Overall enrolment is far lower. In sub-Saharan Africa, enrolment in tertiary education at 9%, as opposed to nearly 70% in Europe. The economic impact of the pandemic, coupled with a shift to online learning in a context where digital access amongst low-income communities is extremely limited, implies that these inequalities are likely to be exacerbated by the pandemic. Addressing these inequalities and protecting the funding required to stop rising inequality and might improve the pre-pandemic situation will be a huge challenge. I think it was mentioned earlier on, if we look at where donor aid is concerned for education, overall, research by UNESCO showed in 2010, aid to education reached its highest level since records on disbursement were established in 2002, but it then decreased in 2011-12, only slowly recovered since then. Between 2014-15, aid to education grew by $500 million to reach $12 billion US, but still 4% below its 2010 level. So the point is, it's hardly the case that was made by the last speaker that we were addressing these inequalities significantly before the pandemic. Thus, the situation becomes even more striking and urgent now. But I think we need to look at raising the importance of education to donors and, more importantly, to regional and national governments, where advocacy is crucial. Advocacy, though, requires evidence. This is where big gaps exist. We look at the situation where higher education is concerned. In many countries, in both the developed, both in Africa and across other parts of the world, information on which groups go to university, which are not attending, which are being missed out, is not collected. Nor is the data on the benefits of higher education collected as extensive as it should be. The benefits of individuals and society. Such data has to be quantitative, but also can be qualitative. The stories of students who have succeeded and those who should have but opportunities denied them can wield great political capital if deployed correctly. Without this data, in a range of forms, then the case for education cannot be made. Education is the ultimate enabler. It unlocks improvements in health, in the economy, and the well-being of our societies. But I'm not convinced this story is still being told properly, particularly in higher education. Despite working in what is a data-rich environment, we do not deploy this kind of data effectively enough. Better data is not the only ingredient, though, to better advocacy. What is it, for instance, we should be advocating for? The goals here vary across countries and across contexts. A fundamental goal, though, that transcends boundaries should be a right to education through life and for everyone. Where higher education is concerned, it is noticeable when rights to higher education for certain minority groups were extended in particular countries, such as Brazil, for instance, participation levels increased. A rights-based approach has the potential to significantly shift the debate regarding education funding at a post-secondary level. The pandemic has created a need and opportunity for reflection on what is and should be prioritised. In this reflection, the case for lifelong rights to education must be articulated. The question of how this will be paid for will inevitably come next. However, as the previous speaker emphasised, these are political choices. Resources will always exist to some degree, whether in or outside countries. The deployment of these resources be towards education, and arguments must coalesce around a straightforward and bold proposition. Gradualism in a crisis context, or having the appeal of pragmatism and hence being some seen as lower risk, may indeed also have a present greater risk. Partial arguments for education not sufficient when other voices talking about limited resources, calls on government, other needs to fund other activities will be loud and vociferous. Being heard is essential. The final area which attention must focus if funding is to be secured in any way is collaboration and alliance building within and across sectors and countries. In higher education, the extent of political collaboration is far too low, and consequently, in the competition for resources, it suffers. The organisations that endeavour to present the coherent sector-wide case for funding and support, be that within countries or be that across continents, do this on a minimum level of resource with tiny numbers of staff relative to the sector they try and represent. Universities that spend millions of dollars a year will balk at spending more than a few thousand on joining a regional or national body. They're the first to go when it comes to cost cutting. Many, especially old and more powerful institutions, feel they're better served presenting their own interests first. Such endemic myopia will ultimately be self-defeating, open the door for low cost and low quality post-secondary education, attractive to policymakers because it's cheap, but not benefiting students. Perhaps necessity really be the mother of invention here. New coalitions will be formed. The initiative I mentioned earlier on, World Access to Higher Education Day, or WAHED, is a new form of coalition. It brings together students, universities, funders, and NGOs to advocate for a change in equitable access to higher education. Yet it's being delivered with virtually no resources, with 2 or 3 staff started here in London. Why is that the case? Why has nobody else done World Access to Higher Education Day before? Why does nobody else set up and put a little bit of resource, relative resource, into something to focus on the thing that brings universities together across the world? It's not knowledge and learning, it's inequality. But its limited impact does at least show that to leave more resource into higher and tertiary education, the international collaboration is essential. Students have a critical role to play in taking forward the 3 actions above. They can drive data collection themselves with collective action, and the best place to call for a right to learn, as they have the boldness of thought that those worn down by years in the system find it harder to utilise. Through imagination and collaboration, such as what we're seeing today with this fantastic summit and event and the partners here, that's the pressure on universities to reimagine how they see their own self-interest. It's hard to downplay the scale of the task we face, reversing education inequality, especially in higher education, securing the funding to do this. But if it represents anything, education, and especially our students, should represent hope. We cannot afford to lose this hope. Not now. Thank you.